Good afternoon. We'd like to welcome you and thank each and every one of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this event today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Trevor Wolford, Account Manager at ECG. To give you a little background history, ECG was founded in 2001. We provide innovative OSS solutions, design solutions, and professional services that address the operational and marketplace challenges faced by today's enterprises and telecom providers. ECG has experts on staff in emerging technologies, OSS solutions, telecommunications network design, and more, because as we all know, the business of telecommunications involves a number of complex relationships between infrastructure and operations. Today's presentation will be conducted by myself and James Puckett. During the course of this presentation, we will cover the history of Alpaca, its current functionality, the 7.0 release, and the roadmap for Alpaca. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to each and every one of you later on this week. Excitement about Alpaca is at an all-time high, so I'm going to hand it over to James now. Thank you very much.
As Trevor mentioned, my name's James Puckett. One of the principals at ECG. So as Trevor mentioned, we're going to cover sort of the history of Alpaca, what it currently can do, what it will be able to do in Release 7, and then what the roadmap for Alpaca is. So Alpaca has been a product that we've been working on at ECG for a number of years now. And I know some of the folks that are actually in this webinar have had Alpaca for a while. Maybe even as far back as the original release when it was called BWPTK. BWPTK was a relatively small tool, stood for BW BroadWorks Provisioning Toolkit. The toolkit evolved over time, and it was a command line only tool. And we added features to it. The name changed a couple of times. And then we added a web interface in 2013. The web interface at that time was called ManageEZ. It was separate from the command line version. And that when we added the web interface is really when the product began to evolve into what it is today. You can see from the slide in front of you that there's been a number of sort of major features that have been added, including the ability to do user and device migration, and then in 17, the ability to do group and enterprise migration. More recently in 18, the audit log and audit alerting features, and then last but not least, the individual user as well as the bulk user provisioning support. So I think that the takeaway, what we want you to be able to take away from this slide is this is not a Johnny-come-lately product. It's got a lot of hours and a lot of development into it, and it's not quite a Swiss Army knife, but it does do a lot of different things. So I think the tasks that you can undertake with Alpaca would be broken down into really 4 major categories. Provisioning, which covers not only individual user provisioning as well as bulk user provisioning. It also covers the various migration tools, and we'll cover some of those in detail. Sort of the second broad category of Alpaca would be its reporting functionality. And so in the reporting functionality, we are able to, in the web interface, produce reports on your system or systems if you have multiple clusters. And those reports cover a wide range of information. You can pull those reports on an individual cluster, on an individual enterprise, on an individual group. And I'll show you some examples of those reports as we progress through the webinar. The next broad category would be auditing and audit alerting. As we mentioned in the previous slide, we added the audit track, audit alerting, audit logging feature in 2018, so that it is relatively new compared to some of the other features. And what it does is it allows you to search across your entire BroadWorks infrastructure, regardless of how many different BroadWorks clusters you have, and find individual users, individual devices, individual telephone numbers, individual groups, and then do actions on them, and we'll cover in some detail what those actions are. It also, in that same functionality that sort of came along with the audit tracking, is the audit alerting, and the audit alerting allows us to send emails to the operator and operation staff, and alerts in the web interface when certain things happen. You can control what those things are that get alerted on, who gets alerted, what time of the day or night, and so on and so forth. And then the last broad category would be the custom tools or scripts category. Alpaca started out as a command line tool, and in order to get the command line tool so that it would do the things that we needed to do, we spent a lot of time building out a set of libraries that had the ability to manage and manipulate really any setting within BroadWorks. If it's available via the OCIP interface, then Alpaca has the ability to extract that information and to provision that information, to modify that information. And so when we wrote that library, with the goal being to use it for our tools on top, we ended up with an SDK that we soon discovered was pretty powerful, and a number of folks have used that SDK to roll their own tools. Our professional services folks have used that SDK to roll tools for customers, and those tools can do a number of different activities, which may be special or particular to your environment, but it does save you the hassle of dealing with the OCI interface directly and having to craft your own XML and send that off to a socket and collect it back and parse it and so on and so forth. So those are the four broad categories of what Alpaca is. And our goal is to sort of provide better BroadSoft tools, and it's intended to be, as the statement at the top says there, a force multiplier for your BroadWorks team. So here's a list of sort of some sample problems that we're able to solve using Alpaca. The problem is listed on the left, and the general solution is listed on the right. And again, we'll sort of incrementally dig down into some of these things. So the problem that we have listed here, we have the fraudsters costing you time and money. If you've operated a BroadWorks platform, it's almost inevitable that you've got some joker out there on the internet that's figured out what your PIN codes or passwords are, that they've figured out where you store your device configuration files, or any one of a number of different ways have determined a way to waste your time and in some cases your money. And so we have to sort of address that, to reduce the time between when the fraud begins and when you discover it. We have Alpaca audit alerts. If you're a company that has been recently acquired or have recently acquired somebody else, then you may find that you have two BroadWorks systems that need to be merged. Maybe they're two residential systems, and you only want to operate one platform because you only want to do one set of upgrades and one set of identity device profile types, one set of interops, one set of patching, all of that sort of fun stuff. And so merging those two platforms, while it takes time, effort, and energy to begin with to sort of get those platforms merged, if you can get them merged in a way that doesn't lose any features for your customers, then over the longer run, you're much better off. And so BroadWorks, while they do have some migration tools, we'll see in a few slides, all of the things that Alpaca can migrate using the Alpaca Enterprise Migration Tool, and we've got a couple of case studies that cover that in here. Um, Conversely, if you've got one platform and maybe you've outgrown that platform, you started out with just a few thousand subscribers, you were wildly successful, and you've grown to hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and now you need to do a cap and grow, or you want to migrate your residential customers off to a different platform. Then you can also use Alpaca Enterprise Migration for that.
If you have a provisioning needs, let's say you are using Loki today or USEP Classic today, and you've been notified that that's going away, and you're looking for a way to continue to have bulk provisioning. Alpaca in Release 7 provides bulk user provisioning. We're going to cover that in a fair amount of detail at the tail end of this webinar. If you have devices that are using a different protocol than you prefer, maybe they're using FTP and you wish they were using HTTP, or they're using HTTP and you prefer that they were using HTTPS, then Alpaca device migration is the tool for you. If you have, maybe you need to replace a device. You had a Polycom SoundPoint 500, and you're upgrading to Polycom VVX 650s or whatever, or you're going to Yealink, or you're going to Cisco, whatever the case may be. Historically, it wasn't terribly hard to do, but it was sort of fraught with error. It took a little bit of time to get it done right, because you had to remove all the shared call appearances from that device, create a new device, put the new device in place, and then rehook up all of the features and services that used that device. It absolutely could be done manually, but it would take minutes to do. And device migration enables doing that in seconds, and it's done in a very consistent, reliable way, so that you don't lose any data. Let's say you've got a BroadWorks platform. Maybe you're one of those folks that has a BroadWorks platform that really don't want to be on a BroadWorks platform anymore. Maybe you merged with another service provider that has a non-BroadWorks platform that has more customers on it, or that you like better. The Alpaca export tool, which works very similar to the enterprise migration tool, gives you the ability to export your data from BroadWorks into an Alpaca format that's machine readable. It's standard JSON readable, and then you could use that to import that into your Metaswitch or your Genband or Ribbon or whatever your destination platform is. Now, the export tool isn't gonna do that import for you, but it will get the data out of BroadWorks and make it available for your programmers, or for our professional services folks, to be able to slice and dice that data. Maybe you have a lab, and this is one that we use a lot. Maybe you have a lab and you want to be able to reset your lab back to a known good configuration, every time you do a set of testing. Well, certainly you can do that by backing up the entire database and restoring that. But if you're a service provider of any size, you probably have multiple different projects going on in your lab, using different service providers, different devices, different groups, at different stages of completion in your lab. And so what we can do is we can use the Alpaca export tool in concert with the Alpaca import tool to back up any individual enterprise or service provider, or group for that matter, to a file, and then you can do whatever you want to with it: slice it, dice it, delete it, make modifications. And then once you're done with your testing, you could use the Alpaca import tool to reset everything back to the way that it was, which is pretty handy. And we use this internally in our testing. We run something like 20,000 individual unit tests every day, and a big chunk of those use the the import and export functionality to get things to a reasonable starting point. Let's say you need to reconcile users, groups, devices for billing. Maybe you need to provide a report to the customer to say, hey, these are your users, or these are your user services. Maybe you need to track down exactly which user or set of users is using some set of features. Maybe you're low on some license or another, and you want to be able to look at that stuff. Well, Alpaca Reports provides a number of different ways to, again, slice and dice that data so that you can see what is in your BroadWorks, and it's it can be used across multiple clusters also. And then lastly, from a problem solved perspective, if you need to quickly troubleshoot changes on a user account, this would be more for maybe a tech support staff perspective. If you have a user that calls and says, hey, my phone's not ringing anymore, well, certainly you could log into your SBC and various other places and make sure that they're registered. And that's very, very handy. But what if it's a BroadWorks provisioning question? Did they enable do not disturb? Did they set up call forward always, so on and so forth? And certainly you can point and click your way through the standard BroadWorks web interface or your user web self-care portal to look at what those settings are and sort of check each one of them visually. Alternatively, you could type in that user's username in Alpaca and bring up the history of the changes made by that user or on that user, really from whenever you started using Alpaca. So, for months, weeks, years in some cases, we have folks that have audit log history going all the way back to when it initially became available, a couple of years ago, and so that can really save on troubleshooting. If you have a fraud event and you want to be able to see, well, what changes were made to a user, or somebody, some administrator or another, it becomes suspicious. You want to look at what they've done. You can pull up an administrator and look at all of the changes made by an individual administrator. So that's sort of a high level list of the problems that can be solved with Alpaca. And sort of the next few slides, I'm going to dig into how some of those problems are solved. Before I do that, I wanted to point out for those folks that are current Alpaca customers, the sort of the three main resources to make sure that you have these. If you've been an Alpaca customer for a while, some of these things may have come into existence sort of since you signed up, and you may or may not know about them. So I wanted to show you a slide, let you jot down this information. The first one is the guide site. It contains most of our documentation, installation guides, release notes, developer guides, SDK information, API information. The second is the ECG portal. As of right now, those are actually two separate interfaces. But the portal contains, and you can see on the right, it contains a list of the software that you've licensed from ECG, and the supported versions, and when those licenses are going to run out if they were purchased as temporary licenses or provided as temporary licenses. It also provides the ability to go in and download the latest software as soon as it becomes available. So that's the portal. If you're an Alpaca customer and you don't have access, please let us know. You can reach out to myself or Trevor. If you have Lance's contact information, he can also get you access to the portal. And then last but not least, the ECG support site. This is the standard ECG support site. If you're a non-Alpaca customer, but you are an ECG customer, then you very likely, somebody within your organization already has an account in our support site. If that turns out not to be true, if you need an account, if you need somebody, need to remove somebody, need to add somebody, or you have no idea whether you have an account, again, reach out to myself or Trevor or to Lance if you have his contact info, and we can get you hooked up there. So some of these things are things that we've already talked about a little bit here, but I wanted to go over sort of the recent Alpaca additions. Now, these do cover sort of several releases from probably 6.3 to 6.6. But in those releases, we've added a number of different things. Some of you have the 6.6 release, and hopefully are finding it meets your needs. Some of you have our earlier releases, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. And so I would encourage you to upgrade to the latest release. If you need help with that upgrade, we'd be glad to help out. So I'm just going to go through these items very quickly and cover them at a high level. So the first two are the ability to add custom plugins for migration transforms and user provisioning. And I'll cover these in a fair amount of detail later, but I do want to explain what these things are just really quickly. Some tools that you may have seen that do provisioning or that do migration are tools that are stock and standard and require a fair amount of configuration, but those configurations are often in the form of INI files or configuration files that give you a couple of different choices based on what the programmer thought was the best thing for you. And we've sort of chosen not to take that approach. It's not that we're choosing not to be flexible or configurable, but we've decided that we wanted to give our customers the broadest flexibility when it comes to what to do with your migrations or with your user provisioning. And so that first one there gives you the ability to change data between the source system and the destination system if you're going to do an enterprise migration. So let's just, as an example, let's say you have a source system that uses the US Eastern time zone. That's what your Linux boxes, when they were installed, originally used. And let's say that the destination system, it actually uses America, New York as its time zone that sort of corresponds to US Eastern. Well, BroadWorks won't let you just take US Eastern and shove it into a system that uses America/New York as the time zone. And so you have to be able to sort of do some mappings between various time zones. Now, as it happens, we actually have a default plugin that we provide that takes care of that. But there may be other things that you need to do during your migration transform. Let's say that your source system has a certain set of licenses that are widely distributed across your hundreds of thousands of users, and you don't want to have to go through and pick and choose and remove those individual licenses before you do the migration from source to destination. We collectively, either your programmers or ours, or working together as a professional services engagement, can write a transform that basically says, well, if you've got this client license 13, I have no idea what that does, but you've got client license 13 on the source and you don't have enough of those on destination, I just want to remove that from the list. I want to, when I pull it off of the source, just remove client license 13 and then add that user to the destination. So we can do that. And in fact, we can actually change configuration on just about every service if you so choose using these transforms. And I'll show you some examples, simple examples of those transforms, specifically the one for the time zones that I mentioned a minute ago. Similarly, we have the custom plugins for user provisioning. You may remember if you had Loki, they used a set of templates, and there was a couple of dozen different variables that you could use, percent username or percent DN, various settings to build a user ID or a shared called line appearance, line port, or whatever. And it was pretty flexible within the things that they allowed, but you could only provision the things that they had sort of pre-thought of. And if you wanted to provision something else, well, then you had to get with Leonid or BroadWorks Professional Services to sort of custom craft a thing for you. And it needed to be generalizable. They needed to be able to turn it on and off with a Boolean value and a configuration file. Our approach allows you to basically, you can configure any setting on any feature for any user that you provision using the Alpaca user add functionality, both the individual user add as well as the bulk user add. And again, we'll cover that in a little bit more detail as we move forward. The next one here is for pausing the task manager. Future releases will provide some additional enhancements to be able to cancel individual tasks and also separate out various types of tasks. I know at least 2 customers on this webinar that have asked for that. So that's sort of the initial release of sort of the task manager functionality. We also released the Alpaca Remote. Alpaca Remote was a relatively new addition. The goal there was to get access to the audit logs because of the way that we use the audit track, audit log, and audit alerting. We need access directly to the audit logs in more or less real time. Historically, that would have been accessed via NFS. Some folks wanted a better way to do that, and the Alpaca Remote, it's a small tool. It runs on the application server, and it feeds the little chunks of the audit logs over to Alpaca as the audit logs change. It keeps the amount of traffic between the application server and the Alpaca server to a minimum by reducing duplication and by reducing unnecessary transfer of data. We released BroadWorks R22 support. It's actually not on the roadmap list, but it should be. BroadWorks R23 support is in the works. We've released the ability to set time zones for users. We have some customers that their PC time zone wasn't really what they wanted to have things displayed in. They had support centers on the East Coast and the West Coast, and they wanted them to have a common time zone. So we provided a way to sort of give that flexibility. We've improved memory utilization. We've simplified the installation upgrades of Alpaca components, such as the Alpaca server and the Alpaca remote through the use of RPM packaging. Previously, it was more in the way that you would do a BroadWorks installation, put a bunch of things in place, change some symlinks and whatnot. But it meant that the upgrade process was a little bit harder and a little bit heavier than what we wanted. So we moved to RPMs. So if you have a release earlier than 6.6, it was what we called an installation in place. And 6.6.1 and newer, it was installed with RPMs. If you need help getting from an installation in place to using the RPMs, definitely let us know, and we'll help you out with that. And then, of course, as with most software, we had a few bugs, and we have fixed those. The latest release is 6.6.4, and it was released on March 9th. We do have a 6.6.5 release that's actually coming out in the next few days. Hopefully by the end of the week. It's in testing now, which fixes another few bugs. There won't be any new features in that. 7.0 is slated for a few weeks after that, so mid to late April. So next I want to cover a few case studies, just discuss practical examples of folks that have used Alpaca to help them solve their problems. So I'm not gonna call out customers by name, but I did want to sort of give you a few sort of case studies. The first case study here is a fairly sizable organization within the U.S. federal government. We've been working with them for a number of years on various things. They had a need to do an enterprise migration from one application server to another. It wasn't a huge migration, sort of when you look at it sort of in the whole, but when you look at sort of the size of some of the enterprises, it was fairly sizable. They also use Alpaca for producing reports and monitoring audit logs and alerting for security issues. In this particular case, the customer, they started out with a fairly important enterprise on their main application server cluster, and then as time went by, they sort of discovered that not all customers are created equal, and this customer had some more complicated operating requirements. They had some more complicated security requirements, and so they determined after they had only added a few enterprises that really we need to move this enterprise off to its own application server cluster. And there were a number of different ways to get there. Certainly they could have done something crazy like duplicate the database and delete the duplicate data and all of those sorts of things. But they had a requirement that there was a minimum of downtime. And I don't mean a few days over a weekend. I mean a minimum of downtime. This particular organization is a law enforcement organization, and they needed to have continuous access, at least as continuous as we could manage, access to their phones and their phone system. So we used the enterprise migration tool, and I want to cover real quickly what some of those steps are so that some of the things that I'm going to say make a little bit more sense.
James,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to stop you real quick. We did have one question from the audience. What are the limitations when it comes to moving users from one location to another?
Okay, so let me cover these migration steps, and then I'll answer that question. I think to answer that question will make a little bit more sense in just a second. So the migration steps that we do are basically we check encumbrances on the source, and then we do an export, we transform the data, we check requirements, we delete the data from the source, and then we import the data to the destination. So there's a couple of words in there that probably don't make a lot of sense, so let me explain those. An encumbrance is something about the source that would make it difficult to move the object in question. For instance, if you were doing a user migration, and this is sort of the answer to the question that Trevor pointed out there. If you're doing a user migration between groups, let's say you're trying to move Bob from group A to group B, but Bob has a phone that has a shared call appearance for Sally on it. Well, you can't move Bob and Bob's phone to group B and still leave Sally in group A. And so that would be an encumbrance. And there's a number of different examples like that called pickup groups, hunt groups. I mean, there's a number of different things. I don't know the list off the top of my head, but encumbrances that sort of prevent you from moving a user from one location to another. So a user from one group to another, a group from one enterprise to another, or maybe an enterprise from one cluster to another. So that's what an encumbrance means. They're the things that sort of would keep an object sort of anchored at the source, making it so that if you moved it, you would break things. And that's sort of one thing that we try real hard to avoid is leaving things in a broken state. And that doesn't mean that if we left them in that state that you wouldn't be able to make phone calls necessarily, but we worked hard to make it so that when you use Alpaca to do a migration, you sort of go in with confidence that when the migration is complete, it will work more or less identically to the way that it did when you started. And the only exceptions to those would be those exceptions that you intentionally broke. For instance, well, I still need to move Bob from A to B, and so I'm going to remove the shared call appearance that Sally had on Bob's phone, as an example. So that's what an encumbrance is. A requirement, on the other hand, those are things about the destination that are needed in order to move that object from the source to the destination. Example of those might be domain names or identity device profile type names, or licenses, or telephone number collision, MAC address collision, all of the other user ID collisions. All of those things would be requirements on the destination that would prevent you from doing a migration from the source to the destination. Now, sort of going back to the question that Trevor asked, there are other limitations, and I've sort of run past them real quickly. Sort of a variation on that question is, can I move an individual user from one cluster to another? And the answer is no, not at least not directly. We do have the ability to move users between groups, and groups between enterprises, and enterprises between clusters. But you can't just take a user and pluck it off of one enterprise and shove that user on, pluck it off of one cluster and shove it into a different cluster in a different enterprise in a different group. There's just, I don't think there's any technical limitation that would prevent us from doing that. It's not a feature or a function that we currently offer. So again, to sort of recap those limitations, you can move users between groups, groups between enterprises or service providers, and service providers and enterprises between clusters. I mentioned, again, I sort of skated past some of these things real quickly, but I did say, hey, we endeavor to not break things. And you should know that when we do a migration, one of the first things that we do before we do a migration in this export here is store a copy of that export. It's the exact same export functionality that we use in the standalone lab testing and various other things. So we make a backup of that. And if something goes badly wrong, in general, we can delete the item from the source and then reload from the export, and everything comes back just like it's supposed to. So, do no harm, I think is we work real hard on that. So here's a sort of a view, and I know these may be a little bit hard to see. This is a view of the Alpaca web interface when doing an enterprise migration. This is an example migration. This is not a migration for the customer that's sort of covered in this case study. But in this particular case, we're migrating a user from cluster 2, or a service provider from cluster 2 called VoIP Inc. Over to cluster 1. We check the encumbrances, we check the requirements, we check for domain conflicts, and then you click the execute button. It creates a task and moves you over to the task page. You can see down here at the bottom, it gives you a fair amount of detail in the logs. There's also a backup of that service provider. That's the blue button here. And then it runs. You get an update in real time. And then when it's all complete, this box here, it either turns green or it turns red. Red is bad, green is good, and gives you a little bit of output on what happened. There is not, unlike some of the tools that we've seen, there is not a command line script that has to be run. There's no tinkering around in JSON files or editing individual text files. It's all done via the web interface. It's pretty point and clicky, drag and droppy. Once you've done the integration, once we've sort of worked with you to make sure that we've dealt with all of the edge cases that are special about your network, these things really can be done by just normal operations staff. They don't have to be done by a high-level engineer in order to make these things successful. So I mentioned earlier, the operator originally provisioned the first 4 enterprises of their new tenant onto their existing application server, and ultimately decided they needed to move them. As I also mentioned, it was a relatively small migration of only 2,500 users across those 4 enterprises. But I think the important thing to note here is that the largest enterprise, done in one big chunk, of 2,235 users. It was done in one maintenance window with relatively little downtime. And when when everything came back, the phones were able to register. They were able to make phone calls. They still had, their voicemail settings. They still had, same PIN codes and passwords. There was no, more or less, the end users were oblivious to the fact that they had been migrated from one application server cluster to another. From a speed perspective, we can do, it takes about 10 seconds to do an individual user. So you can do the math if you're trying to think about, well, when I get ready to migrate folks and I use Alpaca, how long are my maintenance windows going to need to be? How many maintenance windows am I going to need? How many folks can I do in one night? So on and so forth. It's about 10 seconds per user. Now I say about 10 seconds per user because that's going to vary largely depending on a lot of different things. How complex are those users? These users in this particular case were fairly complex. How close was the source and the destination? In this particular case, the source and the destination were in the same data center, so it was fairly quick. How big is the network between the source and the destination? How big is the network between the source, the destination, and the Alpaca server? And in this case, they were, it was a fast network, low latency, so on and so forth. If you have a slow network or overburdened servers, either on the source or the destination, if your servers are very far apart, then it's going to take a little bit longer. But I think as a benchmark, 10 seconds per user is pretty clear. I am not going to read all the words on these slides, but I do have a list of the items that we migrate. And the point here is to basically be able to say, with very few exceptions, when we do an enterprise migration, we migrate everything about that enterprise from the source to the destination. We don't do 70% or 50%. We don't make you reset passwords or passcodes. We are able to migrate pretty much everything, and I'll sort of scroll through here slowly so that you can sort of see the types of things. And I believe this is an exhaustive list. Now, some of these things have asterisks beside them, and those asterisks mean that we don't use the OCI interface in order to gain that information. We use other mechanisms to get there, access to profile servers or access to the times 10 database or whatever. But we get pretty much everything about every service and every feature, whether it be a user service, a user feature, a group feature, or a service provider feature, and we were able to migrate that data. So I have a question here. Let me see.
Yes, James, we've got one here. How does the import-export function work exactly? And an example that they posted was, can I do an export of an object like a user group or enterprise from one cluster to another?
So the import and the export functionality, I listed back on this slide sort of some of the steps. And when you get ready to do an export, it does these first two steps, right? It'll check the encumbrances on the source, and then it'll export from the source and stick them in a JSON file. When you get ready to do an import, it will check the requirements on the destination, and then it actually doesn't do the delete from the source, right? Because we're just doing an import, and then it'll do an import to the destination. Now, the two things that you'll sort of notice that are important. One, we skip the transform steps on an import, and we skip the delete from source steps. Now, the delete from source steps aren't a big deal, but the skipping of the transform steps are a big deal. And so an import, you cannot use the import and the export to seamlessly migrate between application server clusters in the same way that you could do it with the migration. So the migration sort of wraps the import, the export, includes the transform steps, and deletes the information from the source, means that it enables you to change the things that you need to be able to change between the source and the destination. Now, That said, there are some cases where if your application servers are set up the way that we need them to be, in other words, all of the identity device profile types are the same. They have the same default domains. They have the same. Let's see, what are other examples? There is a list of 3 or 4 things, but those are the main ones. So we'll just stop there. So if they have the same default domain, then and the same identity device profile types, then yeah, you probably can do an export from a source and import it to a different destination. And so what we do for our lab with those imports and exports is we'll sort of build up the test case in the source, and then we'll export it. We do whatever we need to it. We can delete it, and then we can import it back into the same source. We have done exports from one source and imports to another, and we just sort of deal with the challenges. The exports, they're text files. I mean, they're JSON text files for those that are programmer types, and so you can do those transforms manually if you want to, but using the migration tools is a better answer. I see another couple of questions that are here in the chat. When migrating users from one group to another, will voicemail greetings be migrated as well? Also, what about BroadWorks Anywhere and SIM-ring associated numbers, cell phone numbers? And the answer to the first half of that, the voicemail greetings, is yes. We are able to back up the voicemail greetings. Those are included in the archive when the migration is done, and we will insert those back into the destination and hook them all up back just like they were on the source. BroadWorks Anywhere and SIM-ring associated numbers, those also are migrated to the best of our ability. Now there are a few gotchas there, and I don't want to go too terribly far down the rabbit hole, but if you have number validation enabled on the destination but not the source, then it is possible that you could pull a number out of the source that you really can't stick back in the destination. And so, number validation are some of the things that can cause issues in these cases. But those are the sorts of things that we would determine during testing and integration, and we have workarounds for those items. And you only listed three things, but we really do. I mean, it's probably easier to list the things that we don't migrate than to list the things that we do. The things that we don't migrate. We do not currently migrate call center reporting data. Now we do migrate the call center setup, as well as the fact that call center reporting is enabled. But we do not go into the database server and go get all of your historical reports for a call center and move it from one location to another. So those you do have to be careful with, and make backups of those and print out your reports on the source before you do the migration. And then once the migration is done, the reporting will just sort of pick up right where the migration, where the data was migrated. And that's just sort of one example. But things like thin client configurations, all of that's migrated. All of your greetings, all of that's migrated. All of your call center and auto attendant and hunt group and trunk group, all of those settings are all migrated. Really, pretty much everything is migrated. I got another question here. Can you do mass user deletes? Yes, sort of. So you can do individual user deletes. You can click on a user and click delete. You can click on a group and click destroy, and it will delete the group and all of the objects within the group, including all of the users and all of the devices. You can click on an enterprise and click destroy. And it will delete all of the enterprise data, as well as the groups and all of their contents. But it asks you first and say, hey, this is dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this? And even if you say, yes, I want to do this, the very first thing that it does is it takes a backup as an export of the entire user, group, device, or enterprise that you're telling it to delete there, and stores it in the system. So if you make a mistake and you delete something that you ought to not have deleted, then we can use the import tool to restore that data. So yes, we can do mass user deletes, mass group deletes. I hesitate to sort of say mass there, but you can delete individual users, individual groups, individual service providers. Okay, so our next sort of use case here is also not going to use their name, a nationwide vertically integrated voice provider. And in their particular case, they had a number of users that, they had been in business for an awfully long time. And I'm sure this story will not come as a terrible surprise to anybody. We probably all had variations on this story, but they've been in business and they were relatively successful. They've been in business for so long that it was, from a time when, HTTP was the way that things were done. In fact, they were probably innovative when they deployed their IDPTs so that they were doing HTTP and not FTP or TFTP. But nonetheless, they way back when did not want to have to touch each and every phone. They wanted to be able to bulk ship them, and how are people going to guess our MAC addresses and things like that, right? So they had deployed a lot of phones out there that were pointing at IDPTs that were HTTP only, that they, in a lot of cases, did not have username and passwords, or that they were using the default Polycom username and password. And they're like, we're so far down this path. If we have to go touch each one of these phones, we'll be out of business before we get done. I mean, we will all have retired by the time we get finished. We're talking 15, 20,000 phones that have to go be touched, to get these things migrated. And I say 15 or 20 because they did ultimately figure out, well before they decided to do the migration work, what, we really should be putting passwords on these phones. What, we really should be using HTTPS. So it wasn't all of their phones. It wasn't a terribly run operation. It was just, it was easier at the time and a much more naive approach, 10 plus years ago, when they started rolling these things out. But nonetheless, they need to replace these phones. And they had phones, they had customers that had phones. Yeah, they were Polycom phones, and yes, they were older than Methuselah, but they still worked. And so the customers didn't want to pay for new phones. They just wanted them to work. And so we used the device migration tool to migrate their customer endpoints from less secure identity device profile types to more secure identity device profile types that use mutual TLS along the way. Now, certainly you can do that in mass, but nobody, at least nobody at this service provider, was willing to, could stomach the idea that, on some Friday night, we're just going to go change 20,000 phones from using HTTP to using mutual TLS with HTTPS and just hope they all come back. It's going to be great. And so they wanted a much more controlled way to get there. And the controlled way to get there was a combination of device migration and the Alpaca reporting interface. So device migration, this is also a relatively simple interface. You navigate through, and I'll show you the navigation in a little bit. But you navigate through, you select the device, and then you make whatever changes are appropriate. In this particular case, the device name is the MAC address. The MAC address is there, and then the device type is a 550. You can change any of those three things. You can click check requirements. Requirements here is just like the requirements that I was talking about earlier. Requirements are those things on the destination that might cause you to not be able to do this migration. The biggest requirement check here is to make sure that there's not a device with the same name or a device with the same MAC address, right? If you changed your MAC address to collide with an existing MAC address, then we would catch that before we go do a bunch of work to delete this device and try to re-add a new device that would not be able to be re-added. These, as I mentioned earlier, these tasks, they could absolutely be done manually. There's nothing terribly special or magical about these tasks. You'll notice at the bottom down here, and it's in a little bit of small writing, but custom tags, device files, right? We are capturing these custom tags and the device file information, custom device files, and that is part of the migration process. Now, we can use the exact same transform methodology with those custom plugins that we talked about earlier to decide which tags may need to be dropped, or which tags may need to be changed in some interesting way, or which device files need to be kept. But that's, all of that sort of happens under the hood, and you configure it at one time to do what you need to do. And at that point, it's a point and click. It turns a 8 to 10 minute process, assuming you have to make copies of all the custom tags and then cut and paste them as you reload them back. It turns this 10-minute process into a 30-second process. And the benefits there are that you get 100% fidelity. You don't miss a tag, you don't fat finger a tag, you don't forget to re-upload the phone directory file or some custom license file. It all sort of happens under the hood there. And we have the same efficiencies for both our user migration as well as our user replace functionality. That same user, in order to do their project management and be able to make sure that they knew who was using what device types and make sure that they had them all and communicate with the customer and sort of know whether or not there were going to be any encumbrances or requirements going in, they used our reporting interface to be able to do those reports. And this is, you'll notice here, this is a task just like the migration task that we've seen before. It spits out an Excel spreadsheet, which is here. And at the bottom down here, we have sort of a highlighted view of, I think, yeah, this is a user detail report. I didn't go the full width of this thing, but it's got a bunch of different fields, and contains a fair amount of useful information. What type of object is it? Is it a standard user? Is it a call center? Is it an auto attendant? Is it a hunt group? What's the user ID? First name, last name, so on. What features are assigned? What services are assigned? What service packs are assigned? And then, what some of the details are about some of those services. So we can do reporting that way. So that those two things combined, they were able to actually do the migration in a careful and controlled way without disrupting very many customers. Here's a list of the standard reports. The standard reports that we have here are user registration reports, user detail reports, user service assigned reports. I'm not going to read every one of these, but just know there's a lot of good reports here. The Alpaca Advanced Search interface, this allows you to be able to, using this box at the top here, type a search term, and it will search across all of BroadWorks, basically. All of the primary BroadWorks objects at the very least. And that allows us to, and we do this using a shadow index. We're sort of, because we're already watching the audit logs, we keep up with what those settings are. We slurp the data in, we maintain this cache. And so these searches are very, very fast. Unlike in BroadWorks, where, if you want to search for a user, you got to know what the first name or the last name or the MAC address or the user ID. We can actually search across multiple object types. And so when I typed test initially, I got 47 results, and you can see that one of them was a group admin, another one was a department admin. it's a little too small on the right-hand side, but you can actually filter based on the object type over here. We had double-digit number of users there, and then you can click on them. The blue links are all clickable, so that you can sort of hone in on that, and that means that you really can very easily and quickly find your users, your groups, your devices from a single location. This is especially helpful if you have multiple clusters. When you've got 2, 3, 4 clusters, and you want to find a customer, customers don't know what cluster they're on. They know what their telephone number is, maybe, and certainly you can go into the billing system to find out what cluster they're on, or various other ways to get there. But having that data right here at your fingertips means that your support people, they can solve the customer's problems and get off of the phone far more quickly. Speaking of solving their customers' problems, this is just one and several examples of sort of a user security mechanism. We had the ability to, when you search and find a user, if you want to reset their authentication stuff, this is the I can't get into my voicemail call, or my phone isn't registering call, or I can't log into the web interface, or maybe it's a fraud event, and all three of those things are true. You want the ability to sort of quickly make those changes. And so if we'd search for bogus user here, for instance, then you can click any one of these 3 check boxes, click reset passwords. It'll reset those passwords, and then those passwords can be communicated to the user in question. There are other use cases. The use cases that I've shown so far are the ones that sort of pertain to those specific customers, and they're also sort of cover the use cases that ECG felt like, at the time that we were asked, at the very least, that they were generalizable problems to which we could provide a generalized solution. And but that doesn't mean that that everybody has the exact same problems. And so if you have a different set of problems that are not solved immediately via the Alpaca web interface, that's fine. We have the SDK. The SDK is included as with the Alpaca base package. So if you buy the server, and that's what you normally use, but you need to be able to write a custom report or a quick and dirty provisioning change, because you need to go touch all of the users in some enterprise, or all of the users in across the system. Well, then we have the Alpaca SDK that I mentioned early in the webinar. You can use it to build portals, provisioning tools, and it's far faster than just firing individual OCIP commands. We've benchmarked it, and it's multiples of times faster, 15 times faster in one set of tests. We do automatic marshaling, automatic unmarshaling. We do automatic reconnection. It's strongly typed. It's written in Java, and therefore, as versions change, as BroadSoft, Cisco upgrade things, and you get an updated version of the Alpaca library, you bring it into your standard IDE, whether that be Eclipse or IntelliJ or whatever IDE you choose, and you can pretty quickly sort of tell what's changed and make those adjustments, and voila, you're back in service very, very quickly. We provide a full JavaDoc API for all of the Java SDK. It's available on the guide site. That will be being updated to be as modern as we can make it in the April timeframe when we do the release of 7.0. It is a Java library. It does include, in 7.0, it will include support for Java 11. But it's not just a wrapper for these XML commands, right? I mean, anybody that does a fair amount of programming can wrap up these XML commands and fire them off at the OCI interface. We include common helper methods to allow you to perform a specific action across all users. We provide the information builders, the exact same information builders that we use during the export process. So you can go get a handle in Java on an export and do your own transforms and do things with it. And we also provide first-class model objects in the SDK. The next bit here is to cover the bulk user provisioning stuff. I know a fair number of folks were fairly interested in the bulk user provisioning, and this is new in 7.0. It's pretty slick. It combines the customizable provisioning listeners that we've had for a little while now, and gives you the ability to provision collections of BroadWorks users into existing groups. A future release will sort of continue to expound upon that. It'll all be part of the same module, but the initial release gives you the ability to, you still got to create the group, but once with the group in place, you can blast your users into that group. It supports provisioning via XLS as well as XLSX spreadsheets. You can use standard as well as custom validation on all fields. So, and it includes custom calculation of field values. I think those two things are very, very important. There's lots of tools that are swimming around out there now that Loki and USEP are sort of being end of life. But I think our ability to do custom field validation and custom calculation of field values, it's pretty powerful compared to some of the other options. We support the configuration using bulk provisioning of any user or group service. Again, any user or group service. So not just the ones that, not just the 10 most frequently used, not just the ones you can turn on and off with a configuration checkbox someplace, but really any user or group service. Not only can we add the service to the user, so just like you would do in the web interface, you go through and check all the checkboxes, but we can actually configure them based on the provisioning character field. Character field is an Alpaca term, but to guide the provisioning flow so that call center users, users that are set up with the call center character field, they're configured in your way, however it is you think call center users ought to be configured. All those checkboxes will be checked and all those settings will be set, and you can control that with these plugins. This is the web interface. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. There's really not a lot you can say about it, except that it plugs right into the existing Alpaca interface. You choose the file, you click import. It shows you the validation errors at the bottom, and then I didn't add the other slide, but once you pass the validation errors, it will create a task just like the other tasks that we've seen, and gen up all of the users, and then you can have those users be fully configured and ready to hand over to the end user without follow-on pointing and clicking and whatnot, except in very special use cases. The provisioning listeners, these are the plugins that we were talking about. They do a number of different things, and they're very, very powerful. The user ad processors, these are run prior to validation. They are used to populate and calculate all of the necessary fields. They can also perform lookups for use in other steps. They can make connections to other systems. So if you want to connect off to your billing system to get a billing ID, or you want to connect off to a 911 system to do some sort of lookup, or you want to make a database call to do whatever, you can do these lookups in the ad processor step, and then these things are stored for later reference. Then you have the user ad validators. The user ad validators, they actually perform field validation. An example, you may have a standard field validation that says, well, the email address can't be empty. Okay. You might have a custom validation field that says not only can the email address not be empty, it must have my domain at the end. Now that would sort of be an enterprisey thing to do, but let's say you CNN had Alpaca, had BroadWorks, and they wanted to make sure that the email, when it was set up, they all went to CNN.com. You couldn't put your Gmail address in there or whatever. It had to be CNN. You want to enforce that. Well, the user ad validators allow you to do that. Then you've got the user add listeners. These are the things that after validation is passed, but before you actually add the user, we can do these other steps. Other steps might be things like adding numbers to the group, adding domains to the group, adding services to the group. For instance, you might just scale out the group, but if you desire to add a user that has a call center, for instance, or a hunt group, or might be part of a hunt group, then this would be a place where you can sort of roll that back up and make those group level changes before you add those users. Then of course you've got the standard user add requests. Then you have the post user add listeners. Again, these are after you've added the user, but now you're ready to fully configure the user services. It can also be used to associate these users to other enterprise group or user services. And then last but not least, after you've added these users, you can make calls out in that same post user add listener to external systems such as email systems or billing systems to actually update those things to say, well, here's the user ID that got created or whatever. And so it gives you the full flexibility to really control the flow of your provisioning process to make it do what you want it to do. Last but not least, we have the bulk user add complete listeners. All of these other ones, these have existed for a while. The bulk user add complete listener. This is sort of after all of the users are added. These are all inner loop items. This is an outer item. It happens afterwards, and it's used to perform changes associated with, to associate the new users with enterprise group or other users. It's sort of if I need to have all of the users added before I do these other things for a call pickup group or BLF or whatever. And so these are listeners. And I know I went through that very, very quickly, but here is sort of what one of those listeners looks like. It's standard Java. It uses an Alpaca standard plugin interface. It follows the life cycle that I covered on the previous slide. And it really gives you fine-grained control to be able to decide how you want your provisioning flow to go. Any user or group service can be configured or modified using these provisioning listeners, and the provisioning listeners can perform advanced lookups and provision to external systems. Sort of related to those provisioning listeners, and I think the next slide here, are transform listeners. This is the example that I promised early on with custom transforms. We have these custom transforms that you can put in place to modify data between the source and the destination when you're doing a migration. So you've pulled the data off of the source, you've looked at it and found it lacking in some way. There was something that was funny about it. In this particular case, it's the time zone isn't quite right. We want to do a per group information for each group information object in this enterprise. We want to set the time zone so that it's compatible with the destination. Again, this is a stock transform that we have, but I just pulled it out as an example. And we really can, just like we can modify, we can provision nearly any service or user using the user provisioning listener plugins. You can do the exact same thing with the migration transforms. Really, any service that we extract the data on the source and use that data in the destination, it can be transformed prior to shoving it into the destination. Next, we have the roadmap, the Alpaca roadmap. This is the list. I didn't provide dates for any of these things. We are endeavoring to get Alpaca 7 out in 3 weeks, and then we'll pick up the rest of these things right after that as we can. We try to add at least a couple of new features with each release. But on the roadmap are bulk provisioning of groups. The benefit of bulk provisioning of groups is that you won't have to scale out the group to begin with. You'll just be able to load the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet will have the group information as well as all of the user information, as well as a set of group features that you can configure up, such as hunt groups and call centers and so on and so forth. They will use a similar set of provisioning listeners to the user provisioning listeners, and so that is forthcoming. Another item that's on the roadmap is single sign-on using SAML, role-based authentication, bulk provisioning of service providers, which smells a lot like bulk provisioning of groups, a user web self-care portal. The user web self-care portal is sort of, if you assume that Alpaca and the bulk provisioning is a reasonable replacement for Loki portals. Loki provisioning. Okay, what about Loki portals? And the answer is the user web self-care portal is intended for that solution. Device management overlay. This is a feature that we've been working on for a while, and it's intended to give you a view of the devices with their tag sets and looking at whether or not the devices are registered, when the last time they checked for their config files, when the last times were any changes were made on those devices, so on and so forth. So it's not quite visual device management, although that may sneak its way in before it makes its way out the door, but really for operator use to help with upgrading phones and provisioning of individual phones. Bulk provisioning via the RESTful interface. Now, we do have a RESTful interface. I haven't talked much about the RESTful interface so far. We do have a RESTful interface, and every feature that we offer via our web interface also has a RESTful back end. The difference between the RESTful provisioning, RESTful bulk provisioning, and the bulk provisioning of users, groups, and service providers is that the users, groups, and service providers will take a spreadsheet, initially a standard Excel spreadsheet, and the provisioning via the RESTful interface will remove that necessity and just allow you to hand the provisioning process a JSON that says, hey, configure up this guy this way. It actually already exists for individual users, but that will be added for collections of users, groups, and then service providers. Last but not least, from a roadmap perspective, we have Call Reporter integration. Call Reporter is another ECG tool. Right now, it's a standalone tool, and it will be deployed as part of the user web self-care portal when that's available. Pricing model. I'm not really prepared to talk price because it's actually fairly complex, and I think that conversation would need to be had with Trevor or myself, should you be interested in those things. But the pricing model is something that's a little bit confusing to some, so I wanted to cover that. If you already have Alpaca base, then you have all of the things that are on the left-hand side already, which includes the full navigation interface, searching, audit logs, audit alerting, all of the reports that are stock, basic BroadWorks user settings, including the authentication resets and those sorts of things, and the ability to provision individual users. Now, that is not bulk provisioning. Bulk provisioning is a different animal, but the ability to provision individual users via the web interface is included in Alpaca base. Now, there are the modules on the right, and these modules are additive to Alpaca base. And in fact, some of these modules depend on other modules. For instance, you can do Alpaca base plus user replace. That's no big deal as one price. Alpaca base plus device migration, Alpaca base plus user migration. Those all three are standalone. Alpaca base plus bulk provisioning. Those are all standalone. They don't depend on any other modules. The others, user collection migration, they depend on the other items in the hierarchy here. So service provider migration, in order to get that, you have to have group migration because it wouldn't do any good to move the service provider but not its groups. Group migration depends on user migration. Again, it wouldn't do any good to move the groups without the users. And then user migration depends on device migration for the exact same reason. So these are additive, and be glad to talk about those in detail. Want to announce a couple of changes to the pricing model. We have always offered Alpaca and all of its predecessors as a perpetual pricing model with an annual software support. So starting earlier this year, we added a subscription pricing model that allows service providers to sort of pay as you go. It also gives you the ability to adjust the licensing model modules sort of as you need. So if you started out with multiple clusters and you needed to pare that down because you've done all the migrations you need to, you're down to 2 or 3 clusters, then the subscription model allows you to adjust that over time. So Alpaca will be available going forward as either a perpetual license or a subscription. So I guess the takeaway news is that Alpaca 7 adds support for bulk user provisioning. It's scheduled for release on April 17th. It's now available today, including the 664 release via subscription model. And any Alpaca purchase of Alpaca as a whole or individual modules between now and the end of April will give an additional 10% discount. One that I didn't put on here is if you have an older version of Alpaca and you want to go to 664, we will, if you will open a ticket, we will do that upgrade for you for free to get you on the latest RPM version. That'll make it so that you guys can support that on your own going forward. Are there any questions?
All right, thanks, James. Appreciate that. We do have a couple questions. The first one is, can Alpaca replace Loki?
Well, I sort of covered that a little bit earlier. And the answer is, yeah, from a Loki provisioning perspective and the ability to do bulk provisioning in 7.0, we'll be able to do most of your bulk provisioning needs. Now, it's not a complete replacement for Loki provisioning, but I think for most provisioning needs, it meets the needs. And if you were using Loki provisioning with its API in order to do like automated provisioning from your billing interface, then we'll be able to do that right out of the gate, no problem. The user web self-care portal portion would be a replacement for Loki portals or USEP, at the very least USEP Classic, when that's available. If you needed a web self-care portal prior to then we can use the SDK to build a custom portal depending on what your needs are.
Okay. And we have one more question. When will Alpaca 7.0 be released and available for download? I think we actually covered that. April 17th. It will be available. And if anybody has any pricing questions or anything of that nature, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. I believe that's our last question that I'm showing right now. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Okay.
All right.